Karen calls 911 when black man changes his own Wi-Fi password, unaware he's the police chief. It was a quiet Saturday morning in Maplewood, a suburban neighborhood known for its manicured lawns and nosy neighbors. The sun was just beginning to warm the streets as Malcolm Carter settled into his home office, a steaming cup of coffee in hand. He had been looking forward to a peaceful weekend. No phone calls, no emergencies, just relaxation. He had barely taken his first sip when his laptop notified him. Network password has been changed successfully. He smiled to himself. His old password had been too easy. He was a man of habit, and he knew it was time for a change. What he didn't know was that this simple action was about to turn his morning into a ridiculous storm. Just a few houses down, Karen Whitmore stood in her kitchen, peering suspiciously through her window at Malcolm's house. She had always been wary of him. Not because he had ever done anything wrong. No, Malcolm had always been courteous, polite, and well-spoken. But because he was different. And Karen didn't trust different. As she scrolled through her phone, her Wi-Fi suddenly disconnected. Her eyes widened in horror. She tried again. Nothing. Her brows furrowed. It couldn't be her router. Her son had set it up perfectly. The only possible explanation? Someone was messing with her connection. Her eyes darted around the neighborhood. She saw nothing unusual, except for Malcolm, casually sitting at his desk, sipping his coffee. Her breath caught. He was on his computer, and her Wi-Fi was down. A thought crept into her mind, irrational but persistent. What if he had hacked into her network? What if he was up to something illegal? People like him, she thought, always found a way to break the rules. She grabbed her phone and dialed 911. 911, what's your emergency? There's a suspicious man tampering with the Wi-Fi in our neighborhood, she said, her voice filled with urgency. The dispatcher hesitated. Tampering with the Wi-Fi? Ma'am, could you clarify? I think he's hacking into networks. He's in his house right now. He changed something, and now I can't connect. This isn't normal. Is he outside on your property? No, she snapped, glancing back at Malcolm's window. But I can see him. He's up to something. The dispatcher sighed. Ma'am, changing a Wi-Fi password isn't a crime. Are you in any immediate danger? Listen, Karen insisted, lowering her voice. I don't feel safe. I don't know what he's doing, but I need someone here now. The dispatcher exhaled. They had more serious calls to deal with, but they had to follow protocol. An officer will be dispatched to check it out. Malcolm had no idea that, just a few minutes later, a squad car would pull up outside his home. Nor did he expect what happened next. When the officer knocked on his door, Malcolm opened it, surprised but calm. The officer, a young recruit named Officer Patel, gave a polite nod. Good morning, sir. We received a call about suspicious activity in the area. Mind if I ask a few questions? Malcolm raised an eyebrow. Suspicious activity? What kind? The officer glanced at his notepad. A neighbor reported possible Wi-Fi tampering. For a second, Malcolm thought he had misheard. Then realization dawned on him. His jaw tightened, but he forced himself to stay composed. I changed my Wi-Fi password this morning, he said. That's all. The officer sighed. He had suspected as much. Do you mind if I confirm your ID, just for the report? Malcolm reached for his wallet and pulled out his identification. As the officer took a look, his face went pale. Chief Malcolm Carter. The officer stiffened. His hands tightened around his notepad. He had just been called to investigate the chief of police. Malcolm could see the young officer processing the situation, trying to decide what to do next. He felt sorry for him. Patel was new, and this wasn't his fault. The silence stretched for a few beats before Malcolm spoke. Who called this in? The officer hesitated. A woman named Karen Whitmore. Malcolm sighed. Of course. A slow smile played on his lips. I'll handle this. The officer hesitated. Sir, do you want me to? No, Malcolm said, his voice calm but firm. I'll take care of it personally. Karen was still pacing in her living room when there was a knock at the door. She rushed to open it, expecting to see an officer ready to take her statement. Instead, Malcolm stood there, arms crossed, an amused but unreadable expression on his face. Her smile faltered. What are you doing here? Malcolm tilted his head slightly. I heard you made an interesting call to 911. Karen stiffened. I was just being cautious. You have to understand, Cautious about what? Malcolm cut in smoothly. A black man changing his own Wi-Fi password. Karen swallowed hard. That's not what I meant. Malcolm took a step forward, his presence commanding. Then what did you mean? Karen opened her mouth, but no words came out. The reality of the situation was dawning on her. She had called the police on the chief of police. Because of Wi-Fi. I suggest, Malcolm continued, his voice quiet but firm, that you be very careful about the assumptions you make, Karen. One day, they might lead you into real trouble. She didn't move. She couldn't. Malcolm turned and walked away, leaving her standing in her doorway, heart pounding, face burning with humiliation. As he stepped back into his house, he let out a deep breath. This wasn't the first time he had dealt with people like Karen, and it wouldn't be the last. But he wasn't worried, because next time, she would think twice before making that call. Malcolm sat back in his chair, staring out the window, watching as Karen slowly shut her door. He could imagine what was going through her mind. The embarrassment, the regret, the lingering resentment that people like her always clung to when they realized they weren't as untouchable as they thought. He exhaled deeply, shaking his head. It was always the same story. The suspicion, the assumptions, the manufactured fear that justified calling the police over something as trivial as a Wi-Fi password. But this time, she had made a mistake. Not only had she wasted police resources, but she had done it to the one man in the neighborhood who had the power to ensure it never happened again. Malcolm could feel the weight of that power sitting heavily on his shoulders. He had spent years fighting to change the way people viewed black men in positions of authority. And yet, in his own quiet suburban neighborhood, he was still just another suspect in the eyes of people like Karen. It was infuriating, but it wasn't surprising. He took a deep breath, rolling his shoulders to shake off the tension. He had handled it. He could have pressed charges for a false police report, but he didn't. He could have made a scene, but he didn't. Instead, he had left Karen with something much worse than legal trouble. He had left her with the realization that her ignorance had backfired spectacularly. That, to Malcolm, was punishment enough. Or so he thought. The next morning, he woke up to something unexpected. As he stepped out onto his front porch to grab the morning paper, he noticed something strange. His trash bins had been knocked over, their contents strewn across the driveway. It could have been the wind. It could have been a raccoon. But Malcolm wasn't stupid. He knew what this was. Petty revenge. He sighed, running a hand over his face. It wasn't the first time someone had tried to rattle him. He bent down, picking up the garbage, shaking his head as he did. If Karen thought this was going to get to him, she had another thing coming. As he gathered the last of the trash, his neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, walked over. She was in her 70s, sharp-eyed, and always the first to know what was happening on the block. She leaned in, lowering her voice. You know she did this, right? She whispered. Malcolm smirked. I had my suspicions. Mrs. Alvarez shook her head. She was out late last night, sneaking around like a fool. I saw her from my window. She thinks nobody notices her, but I do. She paused, eyeing him. You gonna do something about it? Malcolm stood, dusting off his hands. I already did. I let her know exactly who she called the cops on. Mrs. Alvarez let out a sharp laugh. She must have turned ghost white. She did. She's not going to stop, though, Mrs. Alvarez warned. People like her don't learn overnight. Malcolm knew she was right. Karen had been humiliated, and people like her didn't handle that well. There would be more petty little acts, more passive-aggressive attempts to make herself feel like she still had control. But Malcolm wasn't worried. He had dealt with much worse in his career. He had stared down criminals, liars, and manipulators. Karen was nothing more than a mosquito buzzing in his ear. Still, he wasn't about to let her get comfortable. Later that day, he made a call to the Homeowners Association. He had been on good terms with them for years, and it didn't take long to get what he wanted. Within an hour, An official HOA complaint had been filed against Karen for harassment. It was a small thing, but it was enough to rattle her. By the evening, he could see her pacing on her front lawn, phone pressed to her ear, frustration clear on her face. Malcolm simply sipped his coffee from his porch, watching. When her eyes met his, he raised his cup in a silent toast. Her face turned red, and she stormed back inside. The next few days were uneventful. Karen kept her distance, and for a while, Malcolm thought she might have finally gotten the message. But then, one evening, as he was locking up for the night, something caught his attention. A car parked at the end of the block. It had been sitting there for almost an hour, its lights off, engine running. At first, he thought it belonged to one of the neighbors, but something about it felt off. He watched from his window for a while, waiting to see if it would move. It didn't. His instincts kicked in. Reaching for his phone, he dialed a familiar number. "Dispatch, this is Chief Carter. I need a unit at my address for a suspicious vehicle." Within minutes, 2 squad cars pulled up, their lights flashing. The parked car's engine roared to life, but it was too late. The officers blocked it in, forcing the driver to stay put. Malcolm stepped outside, arms crossed, as the officers approached the car. The driver rolled down the window, a young man nervous, eyes darting. One of the officers leaned in. "What are you doing here?" The young man stammered. I was just waiting for someone." The officer glanced at Malcolm, then back at the driver. "Who?" The hesitation was all the confirmation Malcolm needed. Karen had taken things further than he expected. The officers made the young man step out of the car. He wasn't armed, wasn't dangerous, just another pawn in Karen's pathetic attempt to intimidate him. But now it was Malcolm's turn to apply pressure. He walked over, hands in his pockets, staring down at the nervous man. "Who sent you?" he asked. The man swallowed hard. I don't know her name, man. Some lady just paid me to sit here for a while. Said she wanted to know if you'd get scared." Malcolm let out a slow, humorless chuckle. "Did you know that sitting outside someone's home, waiting like this, could get you charged with loitering? Maybe even stalking." The young man's eyes widened. I wasn't trying to do anything." "Then tell me who she is." The man hesitated, then muttered, "Karen Whitmore." Malcolm nodded. He already knew the answer, but hearing it confirmed gave him exactly what he needed. He turned to the officers. "Make sure he doesn't come back." The officers nodded, letting the young man go with a warning. But Malcolm wasn't done. He had let Karen off easy before. Not this time. The next morning, he made a formal complaint to the city. Harassment. False police report. Encouraging intimidation. By the end of the day, Karen had received a notice. A court date was set. When Malcolm saw her that evening, standing on her porch, clutching the letter in her hands, her face pale, he knew this was finally over. She had lost. Karen stood on her porch, gripping the court notice so tightly her knuckles turned white. Malcolm could see the emotions flickering across her face, shock, anger, and then something deeper, fear. This wasn't a simple HOA complaint. This wasn't neighborhood gossip that she could talk her way out of. This was real. This was legal. This was her worst nightmare. For the first time, Malcolm saw the weight of her actions settle in her eyes. But he wasn't done watching. He sipped his coffee, standing on his porch like nothing had changed, like he hadn't just turned her entire world upside down. He saw her looking at him, saw the way her jaw clenched as if she wanted to march over and scream at him. But she didn't. She couldn't. Not anymore. She had no power left. She had lost the game she had started. Then, just as he expected, she turned on her heel and stormed inside, slamming the door so hard it echoed across the street. Malcolm sighed, shaking his head. People like Karen never learned the easy way. They had to be forced to see the consequences of their actions, had to be backed into a corner before they even considered changing. But he wasn't naive. He knew this wasn't over, not completely. The real battle hadn't even started yet. That night, as he locked up, his instincts wouldn't let him relax. He checked the doors twice, glanced out the window more than usual. There was something about the way Karen had reacted that made his gut tighten. Fear was dangerous. Desperate people made desperate choices. The neighborhood was quiet, the hum of distant traffic the only sound in the air. He exhaled, reminding himself that he had handled worse. He was the police chief, for God's sake. He'd dealt with criminals, seen violence up close, faced down people far more dangerous than a bitter suburban woman. But something about this, about Karen, felt different. It wasn't about crime or logic. It was about resentment. And resentment had a way of festering. He pushed the thoughts aside and went to bed. But at 2:43 a.m., he woke up. A sound, faint but unmistakable. A rustling outside his window. He stayed completely still, his senses sharpening instantly. Years of training kicked in. His body went tense, his breath steady. He reached for his gun on the nightstand, his fingers wrapping around the grip as he moved silently to the window, careful not to cast a shadow. Then he saw it. A figure crouched by his car. His heartbeat remained steady, but his mind moved fast. He didn't need to guess who it was. He knew. Karen had finally snapped. She had gone from petty harassment to something much more serious. And she was sloppy. She had no idea how to move quietly, no idea how obvious she was. He could see the glint of something in her hand. A key? A knife? She was trying to slash his tires. Malcolm inhaled deeply, then exhaled, slow and controlled. He had options. He could step outside right now, gun in hand, and end this instantly. He could call dispatch and have a squad car here within minutes. He could simply yell and watch her freeze in fear. But none of those options felt right. Not yet. He wanted her to realize, truly realize, how deep she had dug herself into this hole. So he did something else. He reached for his phone and hit a single button. The motion-activated security cameras he had installed last year came to life, flooding the driveway with bright white light. Karen froze. For a second, she didn't move. Then, in a panic, she stumbled backward, dropping whatever she had in her hand. She turned to run, but it was too late. Karen. Malcolm's voice was calm, but it cut through the night like a blade. She stopped. Her breath was ragged, her hands shaking. He stepped outside, the cold air biting against his skin as he approached her slowly. "Do you know how many years in law enforcement I've spent catching people like you?" he said quietly, watching as her face twisted in fear. I wasn't, I just... "You just what?" he asked, tilting his head. "Go on. Explain it to me. I'd love to hear it." She swallowed hard, her eyes darting around as if looking for an escape. "I wasn't trying to." To what? Karen had nothing. No excuse, no justification. She had been caught red-handed, and she knew it. Malcolm sighed, shaking his head. "This is sad. Really. You've gone from calling the police on me to trying to vandalize my property. What's next, Karen?" "Arson." Her lips parted, but no words came out. "You know what's funny?" Malcolm continued, his voice still eerily calm. "This isn't just a petty crime. This is a felony. Tampering with a law enforcement officer's vehicle? That's serious. And I have it all on camera." Her face drained of color. No, please, Malcolm. I wasn't thinking. I just..." "Yeah, I know," he interrupted. "You weren't thinking. That's been your problem from the start." She took a shaky step forward. "Please. Don't press charges. I'll leave you alone. I swear." Malcolm stared at her for a long moment. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "This is the part where you run," he said. Karen's breath hitched. For a moment, she hesitated. But then she turned and sprinted down the street, disappearing into the darkness. Malcolm exhaled, shaking his head. He could have had her arrested on the spot. But that wasn't what he wanted. Not yet. Karen was self-destructing, and he wanted her to feel every second of it. The next morning, the police report was filed. The footage was turned in. And by noon, Karen Whitmore was arrested. It happened fast. A squad car pulled up to her house. She argued, screamed, tried to resist. But the evidence was undeniable. Malcolm watched from his porch as she was led away in handcuffs, her face pale, her body shaking. Mrs. Alvarez stood nearby, sipping her tea. "Well, damn," she muttered. "Took long enough." Malcolm chuckled. Some people have to hit rock bottom before they get it. Mrs. Alvarez snorted. She ain't gonna get it. Not really. Malcolm knew she was right. But as he watched Karen disappear into the back of the squad car, he felt something shift. Maybe she wouldn't change. Maybe she wouldn't learn. But at least, for once, she wasn't the one in control.